Dr. Meath. Here it's press by Potiphar 3, PhD, the bunny. On the screen. Not impressed. She's got better things to do, like go study heavy theology. Alright. Whoa! Definitely. Okay. Alright. Hello and welcome back to this our 38th live stream. A doctorate for every bunny. And that was our little bunny beneath. And today we're, like every time, we're going to be taking your questions on ancient Egypt and the Bible. Well, she goes off and snarfs some books. So, so the rules are the same as always, where super chats have priority, and if you want to ask a question and you're not going to do a super chat, which is fine, we do non-super chat questions as well. We just ask that you please preface your question with a Q and a colon. We also ask that you only ask your question once. So as I scan the list of the live stream, I know which questions I've taken and which ones I haven't. And if you are referencing a foreign word or a passage in the Bible, please include either what you think that word means in its language, or what you or the Bible passage. So I have a little bit of context. Okay. So, with that said, let's get into the questions. We're going to take two non-super chats first, and then we are going to get into the super chats. Now, our first non-super chat comes from Chow Yi, and he asks, Exodus 8:26 states that the Israelites' sacrifice to God were an abomination to the Egyptians. Why is that? Does it have anything to do with them being 17 shepherds? Yeah, and it also has something to do with the with what they're actually sacrificing. The fact is that the Israelites sacrificed sheep and goats, and those were not considered to be clean sacrifices by the Egyptians. So the Egyptians want to, they typically sacrifice stuff like beef, gazelle, clean other types of animals. They'll do wild game as well, but sheep and goats are definitely off the sacrificial list. They did not like shepherds. They did not like sheep. They weren't a sheep herding culture. So that's why it was considered to be abominable to the Egyptians, because the sacrificing of sheep was just not acceptable. So that's more or less the reason. So I hope that answers your question. It's a good question, but that's the reason why they found it abominable. Okay, and then we're going to take a second super chat from Sally Sue. Thank you for joining us tonight. Do you have a rough idea of most of the viziers under the Hyksos rulers in Avaris? If so, who do you think Joseph was? Okay, it's a great question. It's actually a really excellent question. Unfortunately, the answer is going to be we don't really know. It's not only that the viziers for the Hyksos were unknown, but virtually we don't know any of the viziers for that entire time period. So we don't know the viziers for dynasties 14, 15, 16, and 17. Now, invariably, they would have had viziers. All those dynasties would have had viziers, because that's just your second in command. But none of them are recorded for the second intermediate period. we have so few texts from the Second Intermediate Period that it's really difficult for us to, even sort of, get a handle on who was in charge. When the corpus of texts was published in Ben Publications for the Second Intermediate Period, the whole book is about 50 pages. It's really, we have very, very little from the Second Intermediate Period as far as information from textual sources. So as a result, we don't know who any of the viziers are. We have not found any of their tombs. So it's just one of those unfortunate matters where, just for the entire time period, we've got a great big blank. So unfortunately, it's going to be hard to narrow down who Joseph was. So anyway, thank you very much for the question. Very much appreciate it. And now we're going to go on to the super chats. And our first super chat is from Brick Creation for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Hi, Dr. Falk. What effects did Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome had on Egypt? Which one affected them best or worst? Each one of those empires had a very, very different effect upon Egypt. In the case of, say, Babylon, the king of Egypt was actually defeated when he engaged Babylon in Canaan. And he had been taken hostage and then released. But his army was destroyed. Now, the king of Egypt, Hophre, did manage to return back to Egypt. But his defensive system was in no way able to repel the ensuing raids that the Babylonians did. Now, the Babylonians didn't do a whole-scale invasion of Egypt, but what they did do is they did raid it. They just came in and smashed stuff. Persia is a different story. Persia actually conquered Egypt not once but twice, and they were very, very brutal oppressors. Exceptionally brutal oppressors. Nobody was sad to see the Babylonians go when they were actually finally ousted. And ironically, they were first ousted by a civil insurrection, and then the second time they're ousted by the Greeks. The Greeks destroy the second Persian occupation of Egypt, and the Greeks, on the other hand, under Alexander the Great, were actually seen as liberators. The Egyptians' relationship with their Greek rulers was actually pretty even-handed. There was still sort of ethnic tensions. There were ethnic tensions between the native Egyptians and the Greeks, and there were ethnic tensions between other ethnic groups inside of Egypt at that time. But the leadership itself had a pretty sort of hands-off kind of rulership, and Egypt benefited under Greek rule. Now, Rome became the 31st province, I think it was the 30th province of the empire in 31 BC. And it did so actually under the reign of, I believe it was, Cleopatra the Seventh's son, Ptolemy Caesarion, who only lived 3 days. The fact is that after the suicide of Cleopatra, they crowned her 2-year-old son king of Egypt. Augustus Caesar invaded Alexandria and then killed the kid after 3 days on the throne. And that's where Egypt ceased being a independent state and became part of the Roman Empire. And under the Roman Empire, things were okay. Rome essentially, had, again, sort of that light touch of the empire policy. Pay your taxes. Pay your taxes. Don't try to overthrow Roman rule, and do what you want. The Romans didn't much care. That's how they more or less governed their entire empire. Was essentially treaty or conquest. And Rome, that seemed to be the policy of the Roman Empire everywhere. Was they first offered you a treaty. If you sign the treaty, you can still call yourself a king, but you're ultimately under the authority of Rome. If you didn't sign the treaty, then they conquered you, and then things could get pretty nasty. So as long as you didn't defy Roman rule, as long as you paid your taxes, Rome didn't much care about what happened in your domestic affairs. So, that's really sort of how each of those empires affected Egypt. So anyway, thank you very much for the question. Very much appreciate the super chat. And we're going to go on to your next super chat, which is for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. Any archaeological evidence for the kings in the Book of Numbers? Og of Bashan, Amorite, Balak, son of Zippor, Moabite, Evi, Rechem, Zur, Hur, and Reba, kings of Midian. Unfortunately, we don't have any extra biblical attestation of any of those kings. We do have extra biblical attestation of those kingdoms, but not of the kings themselves. Not so much for Midian. Moab, definitely. We do have extra biblical attestation of the kingdom of Moab. We also have Bashan, which would have been upper northern Israel. Yes, probably there is some attestation of that being sort of the remnants of the Mitanni Empire. But of the people themselves, no, unfortunately, we don't have any attestation. It's just one of those things that the archaeological record isn't always perfect. And it's something archaeologists have to live with, is that we can only go on the evidence that we have. So right now, unfortunately, we don't have any evidence of the persons. So, but thank you very much for the super chat. Really appreciate it. Unfortunately, that's the best I can give you right now. Who knows? In the future, we might find inscriptions. It has happened. Yeah, a turn of the shovel can change everything. So we have to wait for more turns of the shovel. And then we have Brick Creation with a very, very generous super chat of $50. Thank you very much for the super chat. In Deuteronomy 22:8 is Deuteronomy 22:8 talking about premarital sex, or the R word that YouTube hates. A precept in Exodus 22:16 seems to suggest premarital sex. In verse 25, the words forces her seems different from the words and he seized her in verse 28. Why do some interpret lay on her as the R word that I can't mention on YouTube? Okay, let's bring up the biblical text and take a good look at this. Now, to really sort of discuss this, we sort of have to back this up into verse 23. And it'll be apparent why when we read the text. Okay, starting at verse 23. If there is a girl engaged to a man, and another man finds her in the city, and lies with her, then you shall bring both out to the gate, and you shall stone them to death. The girl, because she did not cry out in the city, and the man, because he was violated his neighbor's wife. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you. But in the field, the man finds a girl who is engaged, and the man forces her and lies with her. Then only the man who lies with her shall die. But if you shall do nothing to the girl, there is no sin worthy of death. For just as the man rises against his neighbor and murders him, so is the case. When he found her in the field, the engaged girl cried out, but there was no one to save her. If a man discovers a girl who is a virgin, who is not engaged, and seizes her and lies with her, and they are discovered, then the man who lay with her shall give to the girl's father 50 shekels of silver, that's a dowry, and she shall become his wife because he has violated her, and he cannot divorce her all his days. Okay. So here's what's going on here. Is we've got a scenario where a man and a woman essentially have sex. Now, one of the things about this passage is it's actually bypassing, in a sense, the whole R word issue. Okay? It's not talking about this at all. It's bypassing it entirely. It's bypassing it because it's not trying to establish burden of proof, for the most part. Because they know that the charge of the R word can go both ways. So it's taking sort of a very, very practical matter. And the difference here is, say, what happens in the city is different than what happens in the countryside. What happens in the countryside is almost a he says, she says sort of situation. So it's not taking it's not addressing really the question of the R word. What it is doing is it's saying, has adultery taken place? In verse 23, when it talks about, this is talking about a woman who is engaged, betrothed, essentially married in promise. And in Jewish culture, to be betrothed was to have the same sort of weight of being a married person. So this is a man who has essentially violated a person who is betrothed, who is engaged to be married. Now, it's expected that in a crowded city that everyone can hear you scream. So if she screams, there's enough people to come to her aid that there's almost no excuse for her not to scream. That it would attract the attention of the entire community. And then the burden of proof then is against the man. It is then assumed that the man raped her. In the case of the countryside, there's no one out there to hear her. So then at that point, if she is betrothed, then it's assumed that the man, who should have known better, did the R word I can't mention on YouTube, and he gets the death penalty. So then when we come down to verse 28, where a man and a woman lie together who are not engaged, and they are discovered. Okay? At that point, it's not sure, because it was out in the countryside, whether it was the R word or whether or not it was consensual. And it doesn't try to answer that question. But it does, at that point, say that, a dowry has to be taken. The man has to take her as a wife, and she becomes his wife, and he cannot divorce her. Okay? Cannot divorce her at that point. That protects the woman from, say, the stigma of, unfortunately, an unfortunate stigma of that ancient culture was, if there had been, a woman had committed sex with the shadow of adultery over it, it would have carried with it a tremendous societal stigma. And she would not be able to remarry. Essentially, it would make her destitute and a beggar. So this is sort of a societal protection that's being worked into her. Now, it is true that verse 25 is different than verse 28. So the words are different for forces her versus and seizes her. Because in verse 28, there's not the automatic presumption of the R word that I can't use on YouTube. That's why the selection of the vocabulary is different. So, in verse 28, the people who assume that this is the R word are sort of reading a little bit into the text. You could draw that. You could draw that interpretation, but it is not necessarily the correct interpretation. So that's what's going on in the text, and it's a rather complicated explanation, but it is also a rather complicated text. So I hope that answers your question. It's a great question. It's a fantastic question, and it's a very generous super chat. Thank you very much for the super chat, and I really, really appreciate it. Okay. Now I need to fire up widget. And it did not catch RG strategy, so this is just going to take a minute to grab this. Not want to miss a single super chat. Here. Okay, our next super chat is by RG Strategy for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Bible here. Okay. Who, in your expert opinion, is the top 5 greatest Egyptian kings? I know Tutmosis III is number 1 from the past live stream. Well, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. It's good that you actually made it here tonight. Great to see you here. Okay. Well, number 1. Number 1's Tutmosis III, obviously. Now, I'm going to have to be very, very honest here. I do have a preference towards the New Kingdom, but let's sort of be fair. Let's sort of take a smattering of kings from across the ages. Let's take the Old Kingdom, the pyramid building age. Okay, I think the next greatest king actually comes from the 3rd dynasty. That would be King Zoser. He had an incredible stable kingdom. He was the guy that came up with his step pyramid at Saqqara. Came up with the sort of the pattern of Egyptian architecture to come. Both the funerary temples, the Uraeus frieze, the pyramid itself, labyrinths under the pyramid. He's got it all. His pyramid has it all. And his pyramid was the inspiration for generations of pyramid builders and temple builders alike. So number 2 has to be King Zoser of Dynasty 3. Number 3, I think here. Well, I'm not going to make these in any particular order because I don't think you can rank them in any particular. I am going to say that number 3 would have to be pick one from the Middle Kingdom. Let's pick a great king from the Middle Kingdom. I would say Senwosret III. Senwosret III had a long-lasting, stable kingdom. There's lots of representation of his artwork. It was also a time of great that literature was being copied. So I'd say Senwosret III. Another one, I'm going to pick another 2, just to round it off to 5. I would say, even though he's a bit overrated, Ramses II. Ramses II, we do have to tip our hat to him. He had a long reign. He built many temples. Many of the records we have of Egypt come from his time period. So I would have to say definitely Ramses II is right up there. He builds a new capital. He has huge and most endearing additions to, say, Karnak Temple, to his temples at Abu Simbel. There's really almost nowhere you can go in Egypt without seeing some influence from Ramses II. He was just a prolific builder. The other one that I think is really sort of super prolific too was Ramses III. And they aren't related. They're actually not related. They're actually separate dynasties and separate bloodlines. But Ramses III was named after Ramses II. And his building was also very, very prolific. He actually builds the largest single temple, the largest funerary temple, which is the one at Medina Habu. And that's magnificent. That's an absolutely magnificent temple. It's big, it's beautiful, and it was the administrative center of Thebes for several hundred years. So it was a very, very important temple. So there's 5 great kings of Egypt. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated, and I'm glad to see you here tonight. I'm so glad you made it. Okay. Now let's see if it's track. Finally. Yep, it's on track finally. Andrew Mansour for $10 Canadian. Thank you very much for the super chat. Good to see you here. Hi, Doctor. How much influence of ancient Egypt is there in Coptic Christianity? For example, our liturgy uses ancient instruments. Is it considered blasphemous? No. No, it is not considered blasphemous. Not in the slightest. The ancient Israelites used symbols from Egyptian culture in their own religious practices. They used their symbols in their sort of domestic stuff as well. Like, for example, the seal of King Hezekiah has an Egyptian solar disk, winged solar disk, and 2 ankhs on it. Those are definitely religious symbols. The Ark of the Covenant owes a lot of its iconography to Egyptian ritual processional furniture. So, and that iconography carries over into the temple into Jerusalem, where there's cherubim everywhere. There's 2 statuary cherubim. There's cherubim on the walls. There's cherubim on the curtains. There's cherubim everywhere. And those cherubim are patterned after Egyptian iconography. Many of the purity rituals that were used in ancient Israel got their inspiration from the purity rituals that were used by Egyptian priests. So, we do have to understand that there is an inspirational factor there that does owe its sort of source to Egypt. So Coptic Christianity, when using ancient Israel instruments, isn't being blasphemous. It's repurposing them. It's repurposing them for Yahweh worship. So, definitely not blasphemous. And there are several influences of ancient Egypt into Coptic Christianity, and it isn't just ancient instruments. It is also the language. Many of the vocabulary in Coptic, Coptic is 90% Egyptian language. So you're not going to be able to completely divorce, say, the culture and the religious practice. It just isn't going to happen. So, definitely not blasphemous. As long as you're focusing that worship to Yahweh, Yahweh can redeem all things, even stuff from the culture. So, anyway, I hope that answered your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Okay. Disciple of Christ for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. In Joshua 2:26, is his curved sword a kopesh? What weapons were most common in this time period? Okay. I am going to pull up here Joshua 8:20. And we're going to give that. Not going to really need to focus here on this. Okay, 26. Now, my translation says, "For Joshua did not withdraw his hand, which he stretched until the javelin, until he had stretched out the javelin until he had utterly destroyed all the inhabitants of Ai." Okay. Now, the word here is kidon. Now, I would have to probably do a word study on that just to be sure. I can take a really quick look here and see if we've got something in, say, Halot that might give us more idea. Not what I want to do, but so let me just quick look in lexicon, see what the scholarship says on this. That is always a good idea when trying to determine a word that you don't encounter all that often. And this is definitely one of those words that you do not. See? Does take a second. Hedon. Okay. It is traditionally, according to Halot, it is traditionally rendered a javelin. But in other texts, it is considered to be a short sword. Kuhn mentions that it is a scimitar, which is a curved blade. So yes, absolutely, it's a curved. It's most likely a curved sword, at least according to the scholarly literature. Now, the matter of what kind of curved sword now becomes an issue, because we do actually have bronze weaponry, and we're in the Bronze Age here. We are in the Bronze Age, so this weapon is going to be bronze. It's not going to. We're not seeing a large source of iron implements at this time. There was some iron, but the Israelites did not use a lot of iron until the point when they actually enter into the land of Canaan. So it's most likely here that it was a kopesh. Now, a kopesh is a curved sword. It's usually about, I would say, about 13 inches. I mean, we call it a sword, but we would more today call it a knife, because I mean it's not a long sword. One of the problems with bronze is it's actually very soft. It will hold an edge. You can kill somebody with a bronze sword, but when we look at, say, the Levantine swords, they tend to be sort of these short, straight daggers. There is one in the British Museum that's very big. That's almost 6 feet long. Okay, and when I think of, say, the Goliath sword, when I think of that bronze sword. However, in this particular case, because it is curved, it's a slashing weapon, and it is probably a kopesh. Because one of the problems with bronze weaponry is when you make it too long, it bends. It bends and breaks. So that's probably what we're talking about here is a a curved, say, kopesh. So um, there were other weapons that were more often used in warfare than, say, swords. The javelin and the spear was the most common. By and large, the most common weapon used at the time was the spear. You also had, say, projectile weapons like bows and arrows. Javelin is actually were projectile weapons which were hand thrown. You also had slings. Now, slings were deadly weapons because we kind of think of these little like pea shooter slingshots. No, 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 no. That's not a sling. That's not a sling. A sling had almost a cannonball-sized stone. We do find sling stones from the Assyrian siege at Hatzor, and they are massive. I mean, they're small cannonballs. I mean, you get hit by one of these, it will make a mess of your day. You definitely do not want to be hit by a sling stone. So when we talk about, say, King David and his sling against, Goliath in his big bronze armor, we have to realize that that's a stone like that, a 6-inch diameter stone, that's, yeah, hurled with deadly accuracy and with force. Because a sling, when it's whipped around, that'll have a radius of 4 to 6 feet. There's a lot of angular momentum on that. I mean, that's going to dent a bronze helmet. And it's going to go right into your head. So, yeah, these were deadly, deadly weapons. But yeah, what Joshua's probably holding here is a kopesh. And there's several of these in museums across the world. They're well preserved, but they aren't big. I mean, it kind of surprises you when you see them, how small they are. Because we think of, say, iron swords that actually can achieve fairly good length. But bronze weapons were generally not that long. As I said, there are a couple exceptions, but generally they're under 14 inches. And that just seems to be just a fact of the metallurgy involved. So, Annie, thank you very much for the question. Great question. And thank you for the super chat. Okay. Amir Esifra for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Good to see you here tonight. Hi, Dr. Falk. Does this mean that James White is a doctor like Dr. Pepper is a doctor? Could be. Yeah, there's yeah, there's I don't like getting into the credential debate too much. I mean, I think there's a time to get into it and a time not to. But it is a problem within the Christian church, and this has been a long-standing problem where and in one way I really sympathize with it. I really, really sympathize with it. Theological education just takes a horrendously long time. And it's really wearisome. You get really, really tired of doing it. Because you're doing degree after degree after degree after degree. And if you do it right, you come up with a list of initials that's longer than your own name. But boy, it beats the stuffing out of you. So I understand the motivation here to take shortcuts. I really understand it. Because it took me 10 years to do all my graduate work. I mean, that's a decade out of your life. That's a long time. And if you think about, what's a THD, it's going to require your MDiv. And then it's going to require a THM. And then it's going to require your THD, which can be, 3 to 15 years length. So, I get it. I mean, I really get how people just want to get on with a career and get on with the work of ministry. But at that point, don't claim that you earned it. So, because it ultimately makes Christianity look bad. It, again, sets us up for ridiculous criticisms. And we've got enough going on that we don't need ridiculous criticism. So, unfortunately, I do hope that James White does complete the proper PhD that he's currently working on. Because he is currently, I mean, in some ways, that current PhD is almost a bit of an admittal that his other doctorate isn't so good. Why do you start a THD or a PhD at age 70 if there isn't something wrong with the previous one? The reason why I say that is, he's also got to know that his chances of completing a PhD at age 70 are very low. Completion rates for after you turn 60 are not so good. It's possible. You can still do it. It just isn't that good. It's a PhD is an endurance race. It is an endurance race. And it's an endurance race that, really takes all your mental fortitude. And doing one part-time, which is what James is doing here, is exceptionally difficult if you don't have the stamina. That is one of the factors they look at when you sort of sign up for a PhD. That's when you apply for a PhD, you actually go for an interview. You're interviewed for this. It's not just, they don't just accept your application usually blind. They actually, there's a panel of professors, you have a meeting with them, and then they say okay, Wagner says White's 59. So maybe he is young enough still. I thought he was 70. I'm sorry. My bad. Okay, but still, 59 is really kind of borderline here. It's borderline. I knew a few people who were in their 50s that were doing a PhD, and it didn't go so well for them. So, yeah, he might, if he earns it, if he finishes, fantastic. Then this whole thing is moot. Whole thing is moot, and we just sort of we forget the past and we move on. Awesome. I would really, really love that. Because I think if he earns the credential properly, he can just forget about all the other bad degrees that he's quote bought. But it is a problem that is systemic in the church. Many evangelists and apologists have fake degrees. It's just something that's endemic right now, and it's disgusting. Disgusting because it's stolen honor. Stolen honor. It's trying to give yourself respect that you didn't earn. And it's even sort of hypocritical because oftentimes they'll do it ragging the educational system, but then, well, if you rag the educational system, that's fine. There's lots of reason to rag the educational system. But then don't claim a degree from it. Don't claim a title from it. If you want to rag on it, great. So, there's also an element of hypocrisy here that I think should at least be acknowledged. So anyway, yeah, it's more like Dr. Pepper at this point until he finishes the current one, and I'm hoping he does. I really, really hope and pray he does finish. So thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Okay. D for $9.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. To raise money for the book, ever consider doing a class for people wanting to deeper dive into Egyptology Bible, but can't afford college time money. Okay, I have considered doing online education. It's something that I have considered. Um, one of the problems, there's a couple problems with online education. Okay, one, you are competing against a lot of people out there. You have to be really, really good at promoting yourself. This is not a skill I'm terribly good at, in all honesty. There are people who could, sell ice to Eskimos. And then you have people who can't market water in the desert. I'm in that latter category. One of the reasons I never became a missionary, it's not because I don't have a heart for the unsaved or for working in a foreign country. It's because I'm really, really terrible at fundraising. I tried it a few times, and it was not a good outcome. So when I look at, say, something for online education, you really have to be, in order to be successful at it, to be able to sell yourself in commercials, to be able to get enough people to sign on to make it worth it. Because the hours you put in for doing a class are tremendous. Now, in the case of a college, the college is really selling your classes. So, you've got the stamp of the college at that point, and you can really just sort of, put out a shingle at that point and earn a little extra money on the side. So it makes sense if you're already teaching at a college. But if you're not teaching at a college, it makes less sense. It's a lot more difficult to do it and earn money. So, at least to make it worthwhile. Of course, you are free to pray that I get a position that would help me do this, but until that happens, it's almost sort of not worth the time. So, and it is very, very time consuming to do a class like this. The prep is just incredibly intensive. Doing classes is very, very difficult. When you do it, as I say, for college, you're being compensated for it. So, when you're doing it on your own, well, then it's a risk. It's a risk. And frankly, if I'm going to take that kind of risk, I'd rather make YouTube videos that, grow the channel and basically help more people. Because one of the things is that, again, we are doing a lot of this education as a ministry. Now, it's an educational ministry. It's not an evangelistic ministry. It's not an apologetics ministry. It's an educational ministry. And it's an educational ministry that where we try to give away as much information as we can. And that's one of the things that people like about the channel is we give away information. Now, we do fundraise here through our live streams and the super chat, but that's almost an incidental to the main portion, which is the Monday releases, where we do the educational content. So, it's a good idea. It's a good idea. It's an idea I have considered, but we've sort of kind of weighed the pros and cons of this, and for the moment, we're not going to do that. At least not for the moment. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Okay, Andrew Mansour for $10 Canadian. Thank you very much for the super chat. Hot topic. Your thoughts on Afrocentrism claiming ancient Egyptians were black, even though the DNA proves otherwise. Oh boy, it is a hot topic, and in some ways, it's a hot topic because it's not sort of a black and white outcome. One of the things we have to kind of realize about the whole Nile Delta is it's sort of cut off from the rest of Africa. Now, there was people did move in and out of Egypt from sub-Saharan Africa. That's absolutely true. There was the further you go south in Egypt, the more you find, say, African DNA. So when you get down to Kush, you're already getting a lot of African DNA. You go into Nubia, you're in Africa. Okay, so that you're going to get that sort of African DNA. The further south you go. Now, the further north you go, you're going to get more Semitic a mix of people, and this is why Egyptologists used to call them Hamido-Semitic. Now they call them Afro-Semitic. But it's that whole idea that Egypt is a melting pot. It's a blend. It's a gradient of people, from frankly practically white on the coast, especially if you're in Alexandria and the Greek territory. Going all the way down to, say, black Africans in Merowe and Nubia, and Punt. So it is a gradient. It is definitely a gradient. Now, the problem with the Afrocentrists is not so much their claims to black ancestry, although they do overstate those claims. The problem with Afrocentrism is much more, say, their view of history in general, which is that they believe, say, all Egyptians were black, and those black Africans went to like church councils and to the papacy in Rome and wrote the theology for whites. So there is a lot of historical revisionism going on there. And that's where we kind of need to draw the line, is really not so much the debatable stuff like, what's the ethnic mix of Egypt, but what was what was their influence on, say, later history, especially in, say, the medieval and like Renaissance period. Some of them make claims that Kemetic priests, went to Vatican City in the 12 and 1500s AD and gave their religion to Catholicism. Yeah, that's not happening. That's not historical. That's not happening. But there were Africans that were very, very influential in the theology of the church. And many of the church fathers were from Egypt. So we do need to recognize that as well, even though it is not necessarily a black African ancestry to those Africans. So it's a complex topic. It's very hot and it's very controversial, and you're not going to find agreement across the board on this. So, but there were black Africans involved in the ancestry of ancient Egypt. But again, it was a mixed culture. It was a mixed culture. It was a multi-ethnic tribal culture. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated, and good to see you. Okay. Angel WVM for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Was gold seen as something divine in ancient Egypt? If not, how is it viewed? Yeah, it's an interesting question. And it was one of the things we have to kind of view Egypt, and this applied to Iran as well, was its relationship to the gods. The gods of Egypt were thought to have flesh of gold, bones of iron, which is really interesting. Like, for example, when in the tale The Shipwrecked Sailor, there is this massive snake deity that approaches the shipwrecked sailor, and his flesh is gold. His flesh and skin is gold. His eyes are lapis. So the Egyptians did see deity as having gold as its flesh and its skin. So there was an idea that there was something divine to this. And one of the reasons why they covered their coffins, their mummies, we find a few mummies that actually are covered in gold foil. And the idea here is this assisted the process of apotheosis. In ancient Egyptian funerary myth, it was believed that once you died, that your body started to decay. So they mummified you. They mummified you to stop the decay process. And that your spirit would take on this process after several weeks of apotheosis. You'd be transformed into a kind of godlike entity, where your bones would become iron and your skin and flesh would become gold. So they covered mummies and coffins in gold to sort of do this apotheosis in ritual to hasten it, to speed up the process. So where corruption and decay would no longer take effect. It's a very, very interesting piece of mythology. So this is why gold was so much coveted for the afterlife, because it gave you a kind of security that that you would no longer be attacked by evil spirits who caused decay and ate of that decay. Evil spirits fed on decay. So by covering the body and the coffins in gold, they would stem that. So it was very, very precious, seen as a divine substance, at least as far as its ability to create apotheosis. So, fascinating question. It's a great question. I wrote a paper on this, actually, and that paper is available on my academia.edu page. It's called My Putrefaction is Myrrh, and it talks about this whole process of the relationship between gold, post-mortem marbling, decay in corpses, and apotheosis. So you can read that paper if you want more information on this. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, Angel VWM for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Again, very much appreciated. Do you think the first 2 chapters of Genesis were written by Moses? Moses or his scribes. Yeah, I would attribute the first 2 chapters of Genesis to Moses, but that's me. I know there's that would probably not get consensus across the scholarship. That's a minority view at best. It is a view that's held by, say, conservative Christian scholars. It is not a view held by secular scholars. Okay, so but you did ask my opinion on this, so I'm going to give it to you. I think one of the reasons why Moses had to write the first 2 chapters of Genesis, and essentially Genesis assembled Genesis 1 to 11, was because he's dealing with many, many cultures. When the Israelites left Egypt, they were followed by a mixed multitude. Many cultures joined them. In the mix, you had Egyptians, you had Libyans, you had Magi, you had Cushites, you had Nubians, you had Amorites, you had other Canaanites. You had this mixed multicultural bag of people. Each one of those cultures would have had its own creation myths. It would have had its own ideas of divinity. It would have had its own ideas of how the gods were created. If Moses had just sort of left this to chance, it could have ended up a real mess. Because people tend to worship the gods they always take with them. I think what he had to do is he had to create an anti-myth. A myth instead of all the myths they have. Anti here meaning instead of. So Moses is creating an anti-myth in the first 11 chapters of Genesis based on, say, oral traditions and oral myth, oral passing down of mythohistory, to essentially provide a replacement. Basically, an official version of the founding of the world, so that there is consistency to basically bring cohesion across not just this mixed multitude, but also the 12 tribes. Because we have to remember, when the 12 tribes are coming out of Egypt, they're Baal worshippers, they're Astarte worshippers, they're Reshef worshippers, they're anything but Yahweh worshippers. Baal has his own creation myth. That's the Baal cycle. The largest temple in Avaris was Baal's. And we, of course, know the Baal cycle from the Ugaritic texts. So he's got to create something that replaces all of that. And most of all, something that sort of defeats the Baal cycle. And, say, the Mesopotamian myths that may have been also in circulation. So, yeah, I don't think there was any way that Moses would have gotten cohesion, religious cohesion, within that mixed group unless he had written, say, the first chapters of Genesis. Now, with that said, were the chapters of Genesis written in the order that we have them today? And I'm sort of thinking probably not. He probably didn't write them all at the same time. He probably didn't write them sequentially. They may have been moved around in order by, say, a later editor, maybe Joshua. But I think it was necessary to create that going into the Promised Land while there was still sort of this, everyone was still in the same place. I think once they enter into the Holy Land, it would become very, very difficult for one tribal group to start making this myth and then distributing it. So, those are my reasons for thinking that the first two Genesis were written by Moses. Again, scholarship is not going to agree with me here, but I'm comfortable with that. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. The Bible Exegete for 25 RON, which I know I looked up in the past, but I just can't remember the currency. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Do you agree with Ariel Kozlov that there was a pandemic in the ancient Near East starting during Amenhotep III that prolonged for about the 14th century BC? No. Now, we do have a record of a pandemic in the Late Bronze Age, okay, but it comes later. It actually comes during the reign of Merneptah, which is happens in the 13th century, so a century later. We do have a record that there was a pandemic that was brought to Hatti, the Hittite Empire, from Egypt, that was so severe that it ended up killing even the king Supiluluma the first. So, yeah, there's definitely evidence of pandemics at that time. I don't think it's as early as Amenhotep III, because at that point the pandemic would sort of have burned out. But definitely during, say, maybe the reign, as early as the reign of Ramses II into the reign of Merneptah. Because the reign of Merneptah isn't that long. It isn't that long. It's only about 10 years. So the idea that the plague started during the reign of Ramses II is very conceivable. As far back as Amenhotep III, I doubt it. Sort of doubt it. She might have evidence. I don't know. I haven't read her view. And I want to make that clear, I don't know of any evidence of a plague during the reign of Amenhotep. Now, it is clear that Amenhotep III had serious health problems. He had very, very serious health problems. His reign was very, very long. It was over 30 years. He had a very long reign. And one of the reasons we know he had serious health problems is more or less his preferred ritual cult was at the Temple of Mut at Karnak. It's a small temple. It's actually open now to the public. It's not a great temple. If you miss it, it's no big deal. But I've been to the Temple of Mut. It's a little difficult to get to from Karnak Temple. You kind of have to take a way around it. It's not the easiest place to get to. And it's not the easiest place to get out of once you're there. But one of the things at the Temple of Mut is all these statues to Sekhmet that were built by Amenhotep III. And so far, there's been over 1,000 statues. And these are big statues. These aren't small statues. They're like 5 feet to 15 feet tall. And as I said, there's like 1,000 of them there. They've recovered at least 1,000 of these Sekhmet statues at the Temple of Mut. Sekhmet was the goddess of illness and of healing. And the way the Sekhmet cult worked was Sekhmet gave you a disease, and if you appeased her, she took that disease away. So that's sort of the scam that Sekhmet did. But Amenhotep III was very ill. He was very ill for much of his reign. And part of the reason we as I say, we know this is because there's so many statues there that it must have been. Egyptologists estimate that he probably started making these statues early on in his reign because there's just so many of them. It's not something he could have accomplished in a short time. And so it very much seems that he did this through his entire reign, that he was inflicted with some sort of illness that just apparently crippling enough that he had to constantly build these statues to try to appeal to the goddess for healing. So that's maybe where she's getting it from, but it's hard to say because I haven't read her argument. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated, and that's what I know on the subject here. Okay. Frodojack for $5. If I self-identify as a PhD in Koine Greek and Biblical Hebrew, does that beat a PhD from a diploma mill? I think it's about the same. You're tempting me to bring out Mr. Empty Conjecture again, aren't you? Yeah. Well, I self-identify as a billionaire, but I don't think that's going to change my financial status one whit. I appreciate the comment, but I would hope you actually learn real Koine Greek and Biblical Hebrew because it's darn useful. It's really, really useful to know those languages, especially if you're doing any work in the Bible. Absolutely learn those languages. You can still get a PhD in those languages. I mean, one of the things that people don't realize about both Koine Greek and Biblical Hebrew is that there's still linguistic work to be done. Still linguistic work. Koine Greek, our understanding has changed radically since the discovery of the Oxyrhynchus papyri in the 1870s. Even Biblical Hebrew is a language that has been lost not once but twice. So there's a lot of linguistic work that still needs to be done in Biblical Hebrew. You know, one of the interesting things is find this. There's a word in Hebrew, and I did a text study. It was amazing. This was when I was still in grad school, and one of the exercises was to take a word in Biblical Hebrew and do a word study on it. Do a word study from the scholarly literature. So, you know, I picked the word yada. And the word yada means to know something or someone in a sexual way. So it had many meanings. It has several meanings. And words in Hebrew do double, triple duty. So I picked this word, and I thought, okay, there's going to be lots of material on it. This is a common word in Hebrew. This is really a common word in Hebrew. So there should be lots of peer-reviewed literature on this. I found 5 articles. 5. For a word that is as well known as that, to have almost no scholarly literature attached to it was just, it was dumbfounding. It was dumbfounding. I could not believe how little work had actually been done on this. So, yeah, I mean, if you want to do a PhD in Biblical Hebrew or Koine Greek, there's fertile ground. Really, really fertile ground. But don't self-identify PhD, and don't get one from a diploma mill. I do appreciate the sentiment here, though, and I do appreciate the super chat, even though it's very tongue-in-cheek and very cheeky. But seriously, if anyone wants to do a PhD on this stuff, I mean, there's lexicography, grammatical analysis. There's lots of work to be done. Lots and lots of research. Original research that expands the frontiers of human knowledge. And, I do a lot of work in lexicography because I love it. I think, and lexicography is the study of the meaning of words. This is one of those things in, say, for example, in Egyptian language, that not enough work has been done, and I love lexicography. Lexicography is just, love it. It's like a detective work, like being a detective. I get very passionate about lexicography because I think there's so much fertile ground and so many interesting things you can find. So I would encourage anyone who wants to go into a PhD that these are great subjects to do it in. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. Stephen Koselitz, I pronounced that right, for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. How did spiritual beings, Samuel's ghosts, angels, speak with people in the Bible? Did they possess physical bodies, or was something else going on? Yeah. They did not possess physical bodies. Now, how do I explain this? Our brains have a tremendous capacity to fill in the blanks. And this is one of those things that is sort of helpful, or is sort of part of human nature, which is we fill in the blanks when we expect to see something there, and we don't see it. When spiritual beings make their presence known, because human beings have sort of one foot in the physical world, one foot in the spiritual world, we can sense this. We do have the capacity to sense this. And part of the reason why is because our brains are, you can think of it this way, our brains are terrible transmitters, but they're excellent receivers. This sort of speaks into sort of the mind-body problem, where, say, the mind is able to manipulate the body, the brain, because it's able to, the body is a good receiver for the mind. The side effect of the body being a good receiver for the mind is it also is a good receiver to detect other spiritual entities. And what happens then is that the brain sort of fills in the gaps. It fills in the gaps, and there's been a lot of psychological experiments done where where sort of the brain sort of bridges the gap when it expects to see something and it isn't there. Okay? And this is one of the reasons why, you hear stories about ghosts. Okay, now, one of the things that that happened to me when I was at seminary was people would talk to me about strange events. Now, you want to hear stories about the paranormal, go to seminary. I mean, I heard stories about the paranormal that would curl your hair at seminary from people that had no vested interest in lying. Okay, that's one of the things is if you want to be a pariah, talk about the paranormal at a seminary. It's it will make you an outcast in no time flat. For a place where we talk about spirits and angels and demons and all that, nobody wants to talk about the paranormal. No one wants to talk about spiritual entities. And this is one of the things about seminary that you kind of got to realize is seminary is there's a lot of practical materialism at seminaries, and one of the reasons why there is a lot of practical materialism at seminaries is because there's been a lot of abuse of deliverance ministries, where you see demons under every rock. The demon of baldness, the demon of short-sightedness. You do, and that has created a sort of a pushback where you don't talk about spiritual entities at seminary. I did a course on a spirit world at a seminary, and we had to keep the doors closed. We had to keep the doors closed to keep from frightening the others. So when people started talking to me about their paranormal encounters, I got a lot of honest talk about the supernatural. One of the stories that had been communicated to me was, there was one guy who encountered a ghostly entity that would visit, and part of it was because his grandmother was a shaman in New Orleans, and he would describe the man that came through, the spirit entity that came through, as wearing an overcoat and a fedora-like hat. It's always fascinating that a lot of the stories I hear about, say, ghostly encounters, they're fully clothed. Nobody's naked. And one of the things that I think is responsible for ghostly sightings, being fully clothed, it's not that they have bodies, but it's that our mind are expecting whatever, entity we see to have clothes. It's the negative space is there, and we fill the negative space. So that sort of is what we're sort of seeing here with these entities having quote physical bodies. They're not really physical bodies. They are manifestations of our mind's attempt to grasp something that's purely spiritual, instead of human beings, which are, say, mostly physical with the mind operating it. We're spirito or pneumo physical beings. We're spiritual and physical. So when we encounter something purely spiritual, we have to do that to just reconcile it to something in a framework that we find intelligible. Now, with that said, how do they speak? Now, this is good. This gets into sort of the philosophy of the spirit world, where as the mind is the body is an incredibly good receiver of signals. All it would have to do is think it to communicate it. And there have been a lot of, say, philosophical papers on the idea of, a spiritual entity. Can it see things without eyes? It doesn't have eyes, but so can it actually see? Well, it doesn't actually, a spirit being doesn't actually need eyes to see. It just focuses. It changes its perception of it. So with that said too, it could also, think and speak through thought as well. So that's probably how the speaking is going on. And we would receive this as if we had heard it through our ears. Because that's where our receptors are in the brain to receive that information. So while our brain is picking it up automatically, it's not actually going through our ear canals. It is being perceived as if it is spoken. So anyway, I hope that explains it. It's a very difficult topic. We're talking high philosophy and metaphysics here. But there are men who've done a lot more work on this than I. I've done a little work on this, but it's not a specialty of mine. But that's as far as I understand it. I'd like to do more work on this because it is an interest of mine. So again, in my copious free time, which I have very little of. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. I hope that answered your question. Okay, Sentinel Apologetics for $10 Australian. Good to see you, friend. Daddy Falk, blessings. Check out my expose of Petro this morning. Okay, I will. And to anyone listening, if you're not subscribed to Sentinel Apologetics, go over to his channel and subscribe. He does great stuff. Really appreciate his ministry. A dangerous doomsday Gnostic cult. Agreed. Thank you for your blend of scholarship and pastoral care on this issue. Blessings. Well, it's my pleasure. We do try to help people, and I want to do more work with Rob here on his engagement of this theology. Now he's talking here about Michael Petro's Voice of Healing cult, which is a Gnostic cult. It's a cult that believes in Gnosticism, and it's classically Gnostic. It does believe that in an allegorical reading of Scripture, it believes that the flesh is evil and spirit is good. So you try to you're not resurrected. You just become an ascended spirit being. So this is all classic Gnosticism, classic Gnosticism, and it's no different than, say, the Gnostic cults of, say, the first centuries BC AD. So anyway, it was good to see you on here tonight. I'm glad you could make it, Rob. It's always great to have you on the channel. It's and your ministry here has been incredibly successful towards helping the people in the Valley of Healing get out and free themselves to the everlasting life of Jesus Christ. And that's what's important. So thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. And again, subscribe to his channel. Great channel. Hey, Cam Britt for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Okay, what was the ancient Israelite view of ghosts? They believe in ghosts. Is their existence is implied by the prohibition of necromancy and the Witch of Endor event? Thanks. Okay. It's not just implied there, although it is definitely applied. It is absolutely true that they believed in ghosts. And ghosts here being the returned spirits of the dead. See if I can message very quickly. Okay, did we miss a super chat? Okay. Okay. I can't find it at the moment. There is a scripture out there that prohibits talking to the dead, and I think it is in the Pentateuch. If I remember quite right. Quick scan here. See if I can find it. Okay. We have, for example, Deuteronomy 18:10 up here. Okay. 18:10 and 11. There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his sons or daughters pass through the fire. That's Moloch, child sacrifice. One who uses divination. Now, divination is the practice of calling up spirits, trying to divine the future from spiritist practices. One who practices witchcraft, or one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or one who casts a spell, or a medium. Now, a medium is a person who communicates with the dead, or a spiritist, and one who calls up the dead. Now, implied in this is the idea that one is able to communicate with the dead. So, even going back to Deuteronomy, there's that implication that one can communicate with the dead, but it is forbidden. Okay? That's sort of the brass tacks here, is that it is a forbidden practice, even though one may be able to do it. So the ancient Israelite view is that there are ghosts, that one can communicate with the dead, but you shouldn't. Now, there's also implied in, say, the Witch of Endor event, is that not all ghosts are the deceased. In fact, most are not. The idea is that this is a unclean spirit, essentially a demonic power that is impersonating the dead. And this was another thing that I had heard too, when I was listening to some of my fellow students at seminaries, is that, people did encounter spirits. They did encounter spirits that pretended to be the deceased. But, when push came to shove, that they really weren't. They were something else. And I think this is one of sort of the big dangers of occult practices, such as the Ouija board, is that you are putting out an invitation, and you don't know what you're going to get back. So, their existence is implied by that prohibition, but that prohibition exists because you don't know what you're going to get. It's a dangerous practice. And I think that's really what's sort of on the telos, the reason, the purpose for that prohibition, is because you don't know what's on the other end, whether that person is a ghost, or if it is something else. Something else that could, injure you, who could attack you spiritually, who could attack you even physically. There's been even documented instances of that. So, again, this is one of those things where, yes, absolutely, the ancient Israelites had that view, did view the existence of ghosts. They also thought that it wasn't a normal event. So it wasn't something that, ghosts could come to and from Sheol. But they could manifest under special circumstances. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. I hope that answered your question. Okay, I missed one. I have to... All right, let me see if I can... There. Yeah, it did not come up. Stop this and start this. Still cat. Hopefully it'll reload it this time. All right, it did not. So I'm going to have to cut and paste this one. I found it. Just a moment. Yeah, the software isn't perfect. We put it here. This does happen where sometimes the super chat does not. We do take every super chat. So even if I refuse to answer the question, we do acknowledge and thank every super chat. So yeah, by all means, if we don't see the super chat, let us know. Because as I said, our software is not perfect. It does sometimes miss things. That. Okay. And okay. Biblical Thick Historical for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Apologize for the mix-up. We try to do our best with the software we have. Okay. What do you think of the idea that there are parallel narratives of Joseph being sold in Genesis 38 and 39, a classic example brought up by J.E.P. I don't see it, honestly. Now, I know the reasoning for it, which is that the idea that Joseph was, bought. That there's two different words being used for the people that bought Joseph. It refers to them as the Midianites and the Ishmaelites. So the idea here is that one account had the Midianites, the other the Ishmaelites. I'm going to look up a passage here, which is one of my reasons why I don't buy it. Which is this passage right here, which is Genesis 37. Let's see what. Scroll on me here. That's it. Okay, Genesis 37:28. Then some Midianite traders passed by. So that's the brothers. Okay, but this is Joseph's brothers is what's being referred to as they. Pulled him up and lifted Joseph out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Thus they brought Joseph into Egypt. Okay. What this passage tells us is that the Midianites and the Ishmaelites are the same people. It's a synonym. So the whole idea here is that when JDE, documented hypothesis advocates, look at this passage and they see two different sets of vocabulary, and they basically say, oh, well, you got Midianites, you got Ishmaelites. Two different people. Well, they're not really. Because we do know that Ishmaelites inhabited the land of Edom. But they also stretched into Midian as well. And Midian went from Saudi Arabia, the west coast of Saudi Arabia, into Edom and down into the eastern Sinai during the late Bronze Age. So we know this because that Moses was was hooked up with the Midianites, and he pastured his flocks in eastern Sinai. So we do know that the stretch of Midian was a lot different in the late Bronze Age than it would be in the Iron Age, where the territory of Midian contracts to just that western portion of Saudi Arabia. So to draw a difference here between the Midianites and the Ishmaelites is an anachronism. It's an anachronistic fallacy. It's taking a later event, a later circumstance, and then applying it to the past. So, when I hear that there's two narratives here, it's mostly based upon the idea that there's two sets of what's going on here. So, I don't place a lot of stock in it. Now, just to be clear here, chapter 38, that's an excursus with Judah, and it's more or less giving you what's going on during the time of Joseph, when Joseph is in Egypt. And then, of course, you have 39, where, Joseph is bought from the Ishmaelites. So you probably mean the two parallel narratives here being Genesis 37 and 39. My guess, what you really mean here. Chapter 38 is really about Judah, having his, relationship with his daughter-in-law. So, but again, there's a literary reason why you have this this sort of narratival break too, which is to give you a sort of a parallel idea of what's going on. Because what you have also in, say, 37 is, at the end of 37, meanwhile, Midianites sold Egypt to Potiphar. Potiphar's officer, the captain of the bodyguard. And then when it picks up again in Genesis 39:1, now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of the Pharaoh, captain of the bodyguard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. And so we know from the previous text that these are not different people; these are the same people, but it is a resumptive narrative. It's a narrative that's split in half, with an excursive put in the center for literary reasons, not for textual developmental reasons, not for the evolution of the text. So, anyway, that's what I think is going on in this text, and I hope that answered your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. And again, sorry about the mix-up. Again, our software, we do the best with the software we have. Okay, where are we here? Okay, Kwame Adu for 007 for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Good afternoon, Dr. Falk. Well, it's night here. Why do you think I or Horemheb were villainous enough to kill Israelite newborns? Okay. Well, first of all, they were villainous, all on their own. They didn't. Basically, I and Horemheb basically conspired to take the throne after the death of King Tut. And I sends Horemheb out to fight the Hittites, which he just started war. So, what's going on here is palace intrigue. Is palace intrigue? What we have here is Ankhsenamun, the widow of King Tut. She writes a letter to the Hittite court saying, "There's no prince left, and I hate the options to marry." Ankhsenamun is very straight up with the Hittite king. Writes this letter to them saying, I don't want to marry any of the options I've got, which is I or Horemheb. Terrible options. One is a very old man. I is an extremely old man. He's an old, cynical, nasty political player. Horemheb is a brutal general. He's a brute. He's a law and order brute. Not good options if you are a young bride. So, Ankhsenamun sends a letter to Suppiluliuma saying, "Hey, send a son who will marry me and become king over Egypt." And he dawdles. He can't believe what he's reading. Suppiluliuma knows that this would give him vast power, that a kingdom would voluntarily submit itself to him. So he doesn't trust this. He doesn't trust this. And he actually sends agents back to Egypt to find out if this is true. Well, in the 3 months that intervening 3 months, he finds out it is true, but also I and Horem have also found out about the letter. So when Supilumiluma does send one of his younger sons to marry Ankh-Senamun, I sends Horemheb out to kill the young prince, which he does. I snatches the throne while Horemheb is out on the field. So he takes the throne when Horemheb is out campaigning against the Hittites. And the assassination of that Hittite prince starts the war. It's the match that lights the flame that causes the war between the Egyptians and the Hittites. And that war lasts for 50 years. Now, we have to understand that when that war begins, the Egyptians see the Hittites as essentially Asiatics. You know, they're not Levantines, but they are Asiatics. So these are two men that are, very conniving, very Machiavellian. They're exceptionally Machiavellian men. They'll kill anyone to maintain. And while they do have a very robust army at this point, they are fighting an enemy that they have never fought before. The Hittites were a vast empire with a major army. Egypt had never encountered an enemy like this in its history, up to this point. Now they will encounter much worse later on, but up to this point, this was the most daunting enemy they had ever faced. So when you had that large city of Semites at Avaris, start to, multiply, they saw Avaris as being a potential city that could provide aid and comfort to a Hittite invasion. Which is why they sort of took Horemheb took matters in their own hands and sort of killed off the firstborn to weaken the Israelite or the sons of Jacob's leadership at Avaris, killing off the future leaders of the city, to weaken it so that it could not provide aid and comfort should there ever be an invasion. So that's my reason for thinking that I and Horemheb are easily capable of such a villainous act. Because they were capable of the villainous acts. They had a history of it. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. Determined sheeple for $10. Sorry. Yep, determined sheeple for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. Okay. Hi, Dr. Falk. One of my pastors says that Potiphar was a eunuch and that is why his wife wanted Joseph. I am slightly skeptical. Can you shed some light on whether this statement holds water? Yes, absolutely. This is a myth. This is a myth, and this is a common myth. And it's sort of an abstraction. Now, the fact is that the idea is that old translations of the Bible and old commentaries will say that Potiphar was captain of the bodyguard or harem. The idea was that that Potiphar was a guard over the king's harem in the palace, and therefore he must have been a eunuch. Okay. Now, there's a few problems with this. First is the translation of the guard. Now, it is a bodyguard, but it is not the guard of the harem. And there is sort of a difference here. Not everyone that worked in the palace was a eunuch. In fact, what we find from mummification is that eunuchs were exceptionally rare in Egypt. Now, you go to, say, Mesopotamia, anyone who worked in the palace was a eunuch. Okay? Except the soldiers. There were soldiers. Soldiers were not made eunuchs, except for the ones that guarded the harems. And there's a reason, the reason is obvious why soldiers who guarded harems were made eunuchs. But other palace guards weren't. And the reason why is because it was in the best interest of the fighting capacity of the men to not make them eunuchs. We do see this, say, in reliefs of Mesopotamia too, where you have the king with his great big Assyrian beard, and then you have him followed by these clean-shaven men, which aren't clean-shaven; they're actually hairless because they were eunuchs, and then followed by more men with big Assyrian beards. Okay, those other men are either princes or soldiers. Soldiers were, unless they guarded the harem, were never made a eunuch. And we have no evidence from the historical texts or from the Bible here that he was a guard of the harem. As personal bodyguard of Pharaoh, he would have had all his junk because he would have needed it. He would have needed it to have the strength to protect the king. So the personal bodyguard of the king were not made eunuchs. And eunuchs were not that common in Egypt. They were very rare in Egypt. Part of the reason is also because Egyptians did very, very much believe that as much the body had to be intact for the afterlife. So it was a religious thing as well as a cultural thing. So eunuchs are very, very rare in Egypt. They don't happen often. As I say, the only instance you're going to find a eunuch in Egypt is those that guard specifically the harem. Not even the palace guards are going to be eunuchs. Only the harem. And we have no evidence that Potiphar was ever one of these. So, yeah, you have every right to be skeptical here. It's just not borne out by the evidence. And it's an old reading. Comes from old commentaries and old translations, and it's just not viable. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated, and it's a good question. Okay. And Murray of Sweden, good to see you again. I've been noticing you on the Discord servers, and I'm glad to see you here tonight. And thank you very much for the super chat for 50 Swedish krona. Hello, Dr. Falk. How long do you think a year was during Genesis 1 to 10? Okay. That's going to be a very, very controversial issue. In some ways, they are going to be using probably the late Bronze Canaanite year as their sort of cycle. They don't seem to have used so much the Egyptian year. Now, the Egyptian year was 365 days. Not 65 and a quarter. They didn't have the quarter year yet. And neither the Canaanite calendar nor the Egyptian calendar used intercalation. So they didn't match up the seasons to the year. What we know from, say, the Gezer calendar was it was 12 lunar months. And from what we can tell, the early Israelite calendar used intercalation, or didn't use intercalation. It used the lunar observational calendar. So they would determine the month by the cycle of the moon. They didn't have a civil calendar. They didn't. The early Israelites did not seem to adopt the civil calendar until later on in the monarchy period. So at that point, the year was roughly around 354 days, roughly. It is unknown if they did intercalation to make the seasons adjust, or if they just let the seasons rotate with the calendar. We don't know exactly which day. We know by around the time of King Josiah, they started to use intercalation to sync the calendar with the cycle of the sun, the cycle of the seasons, accounting for those such. So at that point, they start introducing syncing the calendar. Not so much with a leap month, like they would do, say, later on, but more or less basically moving the calendar to sync with a certain period. So it's difficult to say how long the early calendar was, but it is looking like it's at roughly that 354-ish calendar. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat, and great question, very interesting. Again, we don't know for sure here, but we've got some guesses. Okay. Chan's World for 10 British pounds. Thank you very much for the super chat. Hey, Dr. Falk. Thanks for your amazing ministry. Oh, you're most welcome. Normally, I can't catch the live streams due to time difference, but my screaming 3-week-old has blessed me tonight. Keep up the great work. Well, I hope you get some sleep. Congratulations on having a 3-week-old. I'm envious. Wow, parenthood is such a great thing. I'm so glad you could be with us tonight. I know there's some people who can't make our channels because our live streams because of time difference, and it's not easy for us to do it every week because I don't know what time I'm going to get off and how my job's going to work. But we try to do this consistently every Friday night at 8 p.m. Pacific time. But we are doing this ultimately for people like you, people who have questions and comments, and this is our opportunity to interact with our audience directly. We do try to interact with comments in the YouTube videos. We don't always have time, and YouTube doesn't always notify me when I do get comments. So we do want to make this the point where we can sort of communicate back and have you communicate with us. So, and we go after the live stream is over. I do go and read all the comments in the live chat. So every comment in the live chat is read by me personally, and I do that as part of my review every night, or every time we do a live stream. So I'm glad the ministry has been so helpful. We do our best to make it helpful and entertaining. We do try to make sure this isn't boring. And we do appreciate your support of our live streams and our channel, and it means a lot to us. So thank you very much for the super chat, and I'm glad you could join us tonight, even if you were kept awake by the blessing God has given you. So thank you very much. Okay. Victor Freon for $4.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. Is there historical evidence to supplement the Bible here that the Canaanites whom the Israelites interacted were a profoundly evil society? Yes. When the Egyptians, like let's take for example the whole issue of child sacrifice, we actually have extra biblical evidence that the Canaanites did do child sacrifice. And how we know this is from the reliefs of Egyptian invasions of Canaanite cities. We have, for example, one relief from the city of Gaza, where the Egyptians invade, and we find this in the temple reliefs in Egypt. The temple, I think it's the Ramesseum. There's a relief like this, where the Egyptians do a siege, and the king is on the top of his the walls of his city, and he's committing a child sacrifice and appeal to the gods to deal with the Egyptians. So, we actually have several points of evidence. It's even talked about in some of the Egyptian texts where the Canaanites did child sacrifice. This is just talking about child sacrifice alone, but there does seem to be definitely suggestions that many of the practices that were done by the Canaanites weren't so good. So, were they profoundly evil society? That's a matter of opinion. I'm not sure that the Bible characterizes them as profoundly evil, but they were someplace they shouldn't have been, and they did need to get out of Dodge. Now, on the other hand as well, we also know that the Israelites did not wipe out the Canaanites, that they interacted with them and even intermarried with them against the prohibition to intermarry. So they did intermarry with the Canaanites, and that is a recorded practice. They did do child sacrifice, which the Canaanites also did. So, there's some strong suggestion there that there's some practices that they're doing that are not so good. We also find some say double dealing, like the Hivites. There was definitely some exchanges of battles, and anytime you go to war with someone, you're always going to paint the enemy as so. And that's maybe propaganda, but it may be propaganda founded on certain facts too. So we do know that some of this is at least true. Some of it is true. How much of it is true? That's something that we're still trying to determine from the archaeology. And there's going to be a limit to how much the archaeology can tell us here. Text will tell us some things. Archaeology will tell us others. And we'll never have an absolute 100% complete. But that's the evidence we have at the moment. So, and I thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, RG Strategy for $5. Thank you very much again. You think Ramses II sent his chariots to recapture the Israelites or kill him? Kill him. Definitely kill him. Here's the reason. When the Egyptians sent out their army to capture slaves, it was the job of the infantry to subdue, bind, and bring back the slaves. And we actually have many reliefs of this. The Egyptian infantry carried this this instrument called a slaver pole, and the slaver pole was used to was tied behind the elbows to keep the elbows behind the back, and it was a way of controlling prisoners for the long march back to Egypt. Chariots did not carry slaver poles. This was something that was carried by infantry. The infantry never caught up to the chariots at the Sea of Reeds. So when Pharaoh's army arrived to engage the Israelites, it was only the chariots. The infantry never made it. It was like probably a day and a half behind at least, because they're slower. And we do find this happening where chariots will far outpace the infantry, stop, and have to wait for the infantry to catch up. And that usually took a day or two. We do find this even playing into effect in certain battles, like for example at the Battle of Kadesh. Ramses II charges into Kadesh with his chariots, gets creamed by the attack that the Hittites set for them, and he's fighting to stay alive. And 6 hours later, the army of Seth, which is the infantry division, they show up and kick the butts of the Hittites. Okay, but they're a half day behind. They're a half day behind. And this was something that was very, very typical of Ramses II too, is that he would charge in with his chariots first to decimate, and then leave sort of the infantry to clean things up. So with all those chariots there, waiting to get at the Israelites, the objective is clearly to kill most of them. To kill most of them. If any is left enslaved, maybe the infantry would have caught up. That's if the infantry was even sent at all. So the purpose of Ramses' chariots here was really to kill people. Was really to kill them. And they could do it from a distance. That's the other thing. That's the other thing we have to realize about Egyptian chariots too. They're mobile, distant archery platforms. Their purpose is to use speed and agility to outmaneuver the opponent and to sling arrows and javelins from a distance, so as to kill as many without coming in contact with the chariot itself. It's not quite like the Assyrian chariot, where Assyrian chariots would drive all over anybody and just not care. That was an Assyrian chariot for you. I mean, think of it kind of like a light tank versus a heavy tank. Egyptian chariots were the light tanks of the ancient world. They're portable. They shot projectiles. They're meant to be used at a distance, but they're not really designed to take hits. So think of it on that level. So I hope that answers the question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Okay, Sean Horton for $20. Thank you very much for the super chat. Good to see you tonight, friend. Okay. While discussing historiography, Walton points out that ruling elites were the obvious sponsors in the ancient Near East. But due to negative press the monarchy receives, it wasn't them in Israel. What are your views on who it was? Oh, that's an interesting question. I have a view on this, but I don't think it was the monarchy per se. And the reason I don't think it was the monarchy per se is because a lot of the writings we have Yes, I did that. It's not the monarchy per se, because a lot of the criticisms of the monarchy are found in the biblical texts. Okay, and obviously, if they're paying for it, they're going to get glowing press for more or less, because they are calling the shots. He who pays for it calls the shots. Okay, so that sort of does preclude the monarchy from writing these texts, because it's not always flattering of the monarchy. We do find that, say, for example, even in the Chronicles of the Kings, it's not being kept by the monarchy, it's being kept by somebody else, because it's not always flattering. Now, that does leave it who is writing this stuff. And I have a thought on this. I think it was the school of the prophets. Honestly. We do know that the prophets had scribes, amanuenses. Like, for example, we have, I think it's Jeremiah, who has a scribe, Baruch. And he's having Baruch take down the writing, and then that writing is then sent to the king, who is reading it, and he's taking the parchment and piece by piece cutting it off and throwing it in the fire. Okay? Yeah. Very cheeky of the king. Very cheeky of the king. Okay. So this is obviously something that is not being sponsored by the king. It is being sponsored by somebody else. And I think what is being sponsored by is the School of the Prophets. I think the School of the Prophets had their own scribes. I think the School of the Prophets, when a prophet prophesied, they're writing it down. So that's who I think is writing a lot of this. I think a lot of the editing, and what I mean by editing here is basically taking books, compiling them together, and say stringing the various pieces of writing, prophetic writing together to form larger anthologies, which we call in the Bible books of the Bible. So that's sort of my view on this. Is I think it's coming out of the School of the Prophets. We do see the School of the Prophets very early on in Israel's history. So we see it at least as early as the early monarchy, but it could probably go even into the time of the judges. So that's what I think is happening here, and that's my opinion of that's my view on it. And we'll see what future evidence holds. So anyway. Thank you very much for that generous super chat. Very much appreciated. We're so grateful for your support. Your support really, really helps us to keep the channel going. And we can't do it without people like you. So thank you very much. Okay. And I think we're on the last super chat here, which is from Slim2K for $10. Thank you very much for super chat and welcome to the channel. Hi, Dr. Falk. From what I've heard, Egypt didn't become a melting pot until Alexander the Great. Is that true? No, it's not. Was the pharaohs and Egyptians black or darker skin complexion before then? Not really. Thanks. Okay. It was a melting pot long before then. We have to understand that a lot of people came in and out of Egypt. There was a lot of migration coming in and going out. A lot of Semitic peoples came from the Levant into Egypt, and we see this as early as the first intermediate period. So right after Dynasty 6, we start seeing Semitic people, tribal Semitic people come in. We see Libyans come into the country. So that's like our first wave of immigration is from Libya and from the Levant and the Sinai. And part of the reason why is at the end of the Old Kingdom, we see the end of the Neolithic wet cycle. Now, the Neolithic wet period is when, say, that whole area had a lot of precipitation, a lot of rain. And so we had actually savanna all across the Sahara Desert. And in the Sinai, there was trees and grasslands and wild game. And it was just a lot wetter climate. At the end of the Old Kingdom, that starts to dry up. And with it, the food sources start going away too. The Sahara starts to become a desert. The Sinai becomes grassland, a savanna, and then ultimately becomes a desert. And so you got all these migrations coming in from, say, the end of Dynasty 6 into, say, Dynasty 11. So, they're in Egypt, they're in the Delta region, they're intermarrying with Egyptians. So, and even before then, there was some migration during the Nagata period. We do have evidence of migration from, say, the Levant. So even into from its earliest days, we had this sort of melting pot situation going on. People did move across Egypt. It wasn't that common, but it did happen for various reasons. We had Magi, which are more of a darker complexioned tribal group from Cush. They're distributed all over Egypt during the New Kingdom. We do have more Libyans coming in during the late period. Sorry, not the late period. The Dynasty 20, we see a lot of Libyans start inhabiting the Delta again. and they become mercenaries for the Egyptians and ultimately then take over. We do see then the Nubian dynasty, Dynasty 25, conquer all the way up to almost Kadesh in the Levant. So there's a lot of people moving around. I mean, you have then the Assyrians coming in and essentially exiling and relocating people all over the place. So we have both natural migration and forced migration going on in ancient Egypt. So it's not quite true that it wasn't a melting pot before Alexander. It was a melting pot before then. But it does also maintain a certain tribal and ethnic identity throughout its melting pot phase. And we do see this today, where, you have people who identify with a certain ethnic group when maybe 4 of their grandparents were something else. That happens. We have people today where maybe one of their grandparents was African American, and they could identify themselves as African American, even though their 3 other grandparents were something else. That happened back then too. So, ethnicity, identity, racial identity is a complex subject. It's a very, very complicated subject, and it isn't just a one-time off black or white thing. It's a process of migration and integration. So, I'll take your second question here. Was the pharaohs and Egyptians black or darker complexion before then? The only pharaohs we can actually say were true, say darker complexion or black African lineage is the 25th dynasty, and that's because they're coming out of Meroe and Nubia, and that is ethnically, say, dark-skinned Africans. That doesn't happen though until Dynasty 25. Before then, most of the pharaohs are either from, say, the Memphis region, which is more into that Asiatic area, or from Thebes, which is also, say, more Asiatic. You can kind of think of, say, the dividing line between, say, more darker skin complexion versus a lighter skin complexion. The dividing point is Aswan. Elephantine. If you're south of Elephantine, you're probably of darker complexion. If you're north of Elephantine, you're probably of lighter complexion. And that just boils down to sort of the mix of the population. So most of the kings of Egypt were north of Elephantine. So I hope that answers the question for you. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, now we are after, well after 10 o'clock. Well, we've been going a long, long time tonight. I've got great questions. I am going to take a couple of non-super chats, and then we're going to call it a night. So I will try to take 2 non-super chats before we close. So let me start scanning here. Super chats. Super. I'm going to take this one here because I've actually done some reading on this recently. From Biblical Bible Exegete. Is there any proof from antiquity that the Gulf of Suez might have been united with the Bitter Lakes? Now, I did a peer review of a colleague's article that tried to make this case. And he tries to make the case that during the late Holocene, or the Middle Holocene, that sea levels were higher, and that the Gulf of Suez did intrude inland into the Bitter Lakes. And there is some evidence for this. There is a salt layer that was when they drilled the Gulf of Suez, did core samples of the Gulf of Suez when they were building the Suez Canal. They did find a salt layer there. Now, the problem is how long. The big question is how long into antiquity was this did this happen? It does appear that it was something that was around during the early Holocene and the mid Holocene, but it doesn't seem to have lasted that long into the mid Holocene. And the reason why is there is a port, a Old Kingdom port at, I believe it's El Tarif. This is where they found the Red Sea papyri. And these are a set of papyri that were done by the builders of the Pyramid of Khufu, the Great Pyramid of Egypt, biggest one. Okay. The bunny's following along here. Okay, so there is a port that is today. Well, she might be uncomfortable too. Hot in here. Really hot in here. That there's a port that dates to Dynasty 4. And today it is slightly below sea level. You can only see it now at low tide. So, while there were higher sea levels in the mid Holocene, it isn't very long into the middle Holocene period that those sea levels drop to what is lower than today. And from what we can tell, though, that port remained in operation for a while, so it doesn't look like that Gulf of Suez united with the Bitter Lakes for all that long. At least not into, say, very long into the Pharaonic period. So, maybe the first first two dynasties, but after that, it ceases being, say, united with the Bitter Lakes. So there is some evidence for it, but there's also some counterfactuals to it as well. So, anyway, thank you for the interesting question. Very much appreciated. Okay, and I'm going to take one more non-super chat. Then we are going to call it a night. And actually, I think I'm going to take this one because it is also very interesting, which is how religiously tolerant was Egypt throughout its ancient history? Very religiously tolerant. Ridiculously religiously tolerant. It would take foreign gods and just add them to the pantheon. It didn't care. The metaphysics of Egypt was pure polytheism. And polytheism is just really, really happy to just add any other god into its corpus. Sometimes it identified those gods with native Egyptian gods. Sometimes it didn't. Like, for example, when Baal was introduced into Egypt, it said, oh, well, this is just Seth. We're just worshipping the same storm god. Baal's a storm god. Seth's a storm god. Same thing. Welcome. Set up your temple at Avaris. Yeah, no difference. Okay. There is also times when it just adopts it straight outright, because there isn't something equivalent, like Bes, the god Bes, the dwarf god. Nasty little god. He's considered a god of childbirth in Egypt, but he's also the god of child sacrifice in other places. Nasty little god. He's imported into Egypt, and they just worship him outright. It's like, oh, well, This is God's not like any of our other gods. He's welcome in the pantheon. Excellent. So, Egyptians were very, very tolerant of gods from other countries. They imported gods from Nubia, Libya, Canaan. Didn't matter. The one area where they're not so tolerant is when a god was brought in that changes the whole metaphysics. And a god is brought in which basically says it's the exclusive god. There is no other god. That Egyptians were a lot less tolerant of. So as long as the foreign god did not change or exclude the presence of other divinities, Egyptians were exceptionally tolerant and adopting of those foreign deities. They didn't care. They were happy to add it all. And this may be also the reason why Yahweh worship kind of died out in Egypt. Might have been brought by the 12 sons of Jacob, but then it sort of petered out because Yahweh was an exclusivistic deity, something not tolerated in Egypt. It had to take Moses to come and bring Yahweh from Midian back to the Israelites, because exclusive worship is something that isn't tolerated. Monolatry wasn't tolerated. This is one of the things we see, for example, in the Papyrus Salier 1, where the king of the Hyksos is criticized because he practiced monolatry. He practiced henotheism. It's said of King Apophis, king of the Hyksos, that he worshipped Baal to the exclusion of all other gods. So while they tolerated Baal worship, they did not tolerate exclusive worship of one god. So he was very much criticized for that, and it's blamed for his downfall. So yes, they were exceptionally tolerant of all forms of practice, and they, even for example, even into say the Roman era. In the Roman era, you did have, say, coexistence between, Egyptian religion and Christianity for quite a while. But it came to a point where, say, the pagan worshippers of polytheism, recognized that Christianity's claims were exclusive. They were exclusive, monotheistic. And that was sort of the tension that, say, caused the riots in Alexandria. And I think it's 54 AD, something like that. So those riots were, the flashpoints of those riots was, say, the exclusive nature of the claims of the Christian God. And even though there was even tensions between, the Egyptian and Greek communities with, say, the Jewish communities that had sort of a very, very similar view of exclusive practice. This is one of the reasons why probably the temple at Tel Yehudia was destroyed. There was a Jewish temple at Tel Yehudia, essentially very, very close to Heliopolis, which is a northeast suburb now of Cairo. But that temple was probably destroyed because of the exclusive claims of the practitioners there. So, they were, as long as you don't tinker with the metaphysics, they were exceptionally tolerant of other people's religions. Tinker with the metaphysics, yeah, they're not so tolerant anymore. So they had their tolerance, but they also had their line in the sand as well. So, and that was pretty much true throughout the entire history of ancient Egypt. So anyway, thank you very much for the question. Very interesting question. And that is going to be our last question for the night. So anyway, I want to take this time to thank all our subscribers who come and watch us. I want to thank everyone who has joined us today for the live stream. Definitely want to thank the super chatters who really, really help us and support our ministry. We really can't do this without the super chatters. So you guys are a real blessing to us. You are a great encouragement to us. And you help us keep the lights on. So really, really appreciate all you guys do. I also want to thank the Patreon supporters who just don't get enough thanks. I do appreciate all our Patreon supporters. You guys help us, purchase better equipment and pay for our internet. And you guys just don't get enough thanks. You don't get enough perks. But we understand that you are giving sacrificially to help us as a ministry. So anyway, I want to thank you very much for joining us tonight. And I will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Good night, everyone.